occupying till he comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries. Welcome, friends. This is David Schnitker with today's Last Days Beacon program. Thanks for joining us. Just a reminder that these programs are supported by your gifts to this ministry. Simply go to our website, www.swpm.us, to contribute. That's www.swpm.us. We are going to be discussing this week and next the subject, Brexit, a new spiritual day for Great Britain. Great Britain's spiritual contribution is both broad and pervasive in the history of the world, and particularly in the founding of the United States of America. The United States' true spiritual founding happened when a bunch of Englishmen and their families landed at Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts, to build a city on a hill for the Son of God. Or one can look at the way that God's Spirit used the British Empire's army in 1917 under Field Marshal Allenby to wrest control of the Holy Land from the Ottoman Empire, to fulfill the Old Testament prophecies of the founding of modern Israel. Many are also familiar with William Wilberforce, the great British Parliament member and strong Christian who authored the two pieces of legislation that led to the abolition of slave trafficking in 1807 and the abolition of slavery within the British Empire in 1833. When Wilberforce first attempted these two great feats, he was laughed to scorn in the British Parliament. Fast forward to the present day, and in much the same way, Nigel Farage, member of the European Parliament representing Southeast England, shortly after the successful Brexit referendum, was able to get up before the European Parliament and say, quote, 20 years ago when I came here and said that I wanted to lead a movement to take the United Kingdom out of the European Union, you all laughed at me. Well, you are not laughing now, are you? It is my firm belief that as God's Spirit empowered the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, in like manner, nearly 200 years later, God empowered the Brexit referendum against all odds for a purpose, that is, the spiritual revival of Great Britain. Right now, the United Kingdom is a spiritual wasteland. The downgrade controversy that Spurgeon battled in the mid-1800s has metastasized to a pervasive theological and moral apostasy. For example, most couples, the straight ones that is, hardly ever marry, and instead cohabit without legal sanction. Also, Britain has become so homosexualized that just for witnessing to a homosexual about their lifestyle can result in being charged with a hate crime. Britain has also become so Islamified that if one were to burn a copy of the Quran in public, they could also be charged with a hate crime. It is perfectly legal to burn a copy of God's Word, but burning the Quran could result in a fine or possibly even jail time. But one may ask, how could Brexit lead to a spiritual revival in the United Kingdom? That is the crux of our discussion. Is the European Union bad? In my view, the EU is not only bad, but just plain evil. In fact, it represents tyranny on the continent of Europe by another name and form. The history of how the EU came into being is a history that a book or even books could, and I'm sure have been written about. There is not sufficient time here to cover it in depth. The original idea behind the European Union was not necessarily a bad one. At the end of World War II, several European leaders wanted France and Germany to sit down together and find a way for the nations of Europe to work together for commerce, for trade, to repair and rebuild their war-ravaged economies without triggering more divisions and thus more costly wars. As Nigel Farage, member of the European Parliament and former leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party, has said repeatedly in the EU Parliament, quote, "The original idea was a good one, but it has become a political experiment whose aim is to destroy the sovereignty of the member nations." End of quote. Remember, friends, that Satan always seeks lordship over people because of his jealousy for God's authority. Mr. Farage has repeatedly accused the leaders of the European government of trying to create a United States of Europe which looks more like the old Warsaw Pact of the USSR than the USA. Back in 2004, when 10 former Warsaw Pact countries were going to become EU member states, Mr. Farage warned them that they would be joining something that was just like what they were liberated from in the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, sadly, they realized that his words were prophetic. The founding members of the EU are called the Founding Fathers. Such terms are, in fact, a smokescreen for the top bureaucrats that control the EU, such as the President of the EU Commission and the President of the EU Council. Both of these leaders are elected by secret ballots by the EU Commission and EU Council, whose members are not elected by the EU Parliament or the peoples of Europe. Although members of the EU Parliament are voted in by citizens of member nations, they can simply be overridden by the unelected EU Commission and Council. So the European Union government is hardly what one could call a democracy. Perhaps a Politburo would be a more accurate description. A prime example of this EU tyranny is when, in 2005, the citizens of France and Holland voted in separate national referendums to reject the new EU constitution that was being put before them. The bureaucrats of the EU did not care about the will of the people, so they simply pushed it in through another way called the Lisbon Treaty. Then the Republic of Ireland held a referendum on whether to ratify the Lisbon Treaty, and they voted no. No matter, EU conspirators in the Irish government just put forth another referendum after the first one was rejected by the Irish people. And they kept doing this until they got a positive result. In the same way, there have been calls for a second Brexit vote in the UK. It is the same old forces from the EU government trying to use co-conspirators and traitors to overthrow a genuine election result they don't want. Hard or soft Brexit? What will it be? And where does Brexit stand today? To answer that question, I want to review what happened politically in the United Kingdom immediately following the historic June 23, 2016 Brexit referendum. Problems began right after Brexit. David Cameron, whose Conservative Party, aka the Tory Party, beat Labour in the last general election in 2015 by promising a Brexit referendum. He made good on his promise, but campaigned hard for the Remain side leading up to June 23. Due to the Leave side winning, he resigned as Prime Minister the next day. The struggle for leadership came down to Andrea Leadsom, who campaigned hard for the Leave side, and Theresa May, who was Home Secretary under Cameron and half-heartedly campaigned for the Remain side. They were chosen by other Tory members of Parliament because they are the party in power. And there will not be another general election until 2020, unless the ruling party calls one. After the mainstream British press beat up Leadsom, she quit. And by default, Theresa May became the next Prime Minister. However, since then, Brexit has come under dire threat from an activist investment banker named Gina Miller, who sued the current British government, stating that Prime Minister May could not use royal prerogative to invoke Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. As mentioned earlier, the Lisbon Treaty has been imposed in a tyrannical way against the will of the Irish, the Dutch, the French, and other EU members. Under the provisions of the Lisbon Treaty, an EU member nation can only legally break away from the European Union by that member nation's government invoking Article 50 of the treaty. Gina Miller's lawsuit was absolutely frivolous, and Miller's attorneys argued that only Parliament could give Theresa May the authority to invoke Article 50, not the June 23rd Brexit referendum. All this was just so much nonsense. Royal prerogative was used by previous British governments to take the UK deeper and deeper into the European Union. Miss Miller's lawsuit was nothing more than another end run around the will of the British people. The British High Court sided with Miss Miller, and May's government appealed to the British Supreme Court. The letter sent to voters before the Brexit referendum by the David Cameron government stated emphatically that the British government would honor the result of the referendum, and if the result was to leave the EU, the British government would take the necessary legal steps to do so. Mr. Cameron reiterated that pledge on June 24, 2016, the day after the Brexit vote, stating, "The British people have voted to leave the European Union, and their will must be respected. The will of the British people is an instruction that must be delivered." End of quote. However, Ms. Miller's lawsuit was a nasty tactic to null the referendum result, and she and her high-priced lawyers knew they had strong allies among the British judiciary. On June 24 of this year, the British Supreme Court heard the government's appeal to the High Court ruling. Miller and her team knew that several of the British Supreme Court justices were Europhiles and hated the Brexit result. In fact, several of them should have disqualified themselves as jurors because they had championed having European law supersede British law. Sure enough, the British Supreme Court upheld the High Court's ruling and said that Parliament would have to vote to give Prime Minister May the authority to invoke Article 50. Many believed at that time that Brexit was on the rocks, and that May's reluctance in stalling after becoming Prime Minister had allowed the door to be opened for Brexit to be undone before it ever got off the ground. Does all of this with the British Supreme Court sound eerily familiar to what happened with the U.S. Supreme Court when it ruled on gay marriage in the summer of 2015 against the views of the vast majority of American citizens? I will say this in Theresa May's defense. She, along with David Davis, the British Secretary of State for Brexit, and their attorneys fought this case hard, and although they lost, May and her team put a bill through Parliament to give her the authority to invoke Article 50. On February the 8th, Parliament voted in favor of that bill and gave Prime Minister May the permission to invoke Article 50. So Brexit, although battered a bit, is back on track, and May has consistently stated that Article 50 will be invoked by her government no later than March 31st of this year. Based on the way she has shepherded Brexit through the stormy waters thus far, I believe that she means it. Just this past fall, Prime Minister Theresa May went to the annual meeting of all the heads of states of EU member nations. When she got up to speak at the podium, she was snubbed so rudely by the other EU heads of state that she walked off without giving her speech. As she prepared to exit, she said, "I think I need to leave now." That is a direct answer to my prayers that she would come to her senses about these despots that she and her team are dealing with. Theresa May also gave her long-anticipated Brexit vision speech on January 17, where she put to rest the fears that her government would not accept a soft deal like what the Norwegians and Swiss have, who are not member states but to have access to the EU common market have to accept the free movement of people into their country and many other distasteful dictates from the EU bureaucrats. Theresa May stated that they were only going to go for complete separation, and many in the EU who wanted to punish Britain are realizing that the United Kingdom has the stronger hand for the upcoming negotiations. My friends, we are out of time for today. We will continue our discussion on the subject, Brexit, a new spiritual day for Great Britain, on our next program. If you would like a copy of this article, you may order it on our website. Simply go to www.swpm.us and click on the Bookstore tab on the home page. You may order 5 copies for a gift of $5 or 25 copies for a $15 contribution. The website address again is www.swpm.us. We will continue this discussion next week. Until then, this is David Schnitker. Thanks for listening.